Welcome viewers to MOOC's online course on Introducing Indian Art and Appreciation. This is the beginning of the third week and first module. This third week is titled as Stylistic Variations, wherein we will be looking at various stylistic variations and stylistic innovations, taking very specific examples of sculptures and paintings across time from the mainstream classical Indian art as well as the folk art traditions. So, this is the first module of this third week, stylistic variation, and the first module is dedicated to Ajanta, one of the supreme examples of Indian art undoubtedly. Now, Ajanta Caves, it is actually a series of caves, about 30, carved out from a solid monolithic mountain body, and that particular rock is not a very soft rock. It is a hard stone known as the basalt rock, and the entire location is located around or along the river valley Waghora in Maharashtra, and today it looks like a very remote place, but perhaps when these caves were being carved out and when the monks, the Buddhist monks, started living in there and preaching and worshipping inside those caves, perhaps at that point of time these caves or this site was not so remote, was perhaps part of a trade route, because the river Waghora seems like it was a very navigable river, unlike what it is today. And looking at the paintings and sculptures in Ajanta also give us a sense, or it suggests that Ajanta caves were visited during the ancient times by people from many other places, not just that locality. People from Central Asia, Persia, North India, Eastern India, even South India must have visited, because the representations of figures from various nations and countries are visible in the paintings. So, we have a hunch that perhaps this location was not that remote as it looks like today. Now, Ajanta, as I have already mentioned, Ajanta Caves more particularly are a series of 30 Buddhist caves, and these are Buddhist cave architectures, not natural caves. These caves have been hewn out, carved out from the solid rock mountain, and interestingly the activities, the carving activities, architectural activities, the sculptural activities, the painting activities at Ajanta went on for several centuries. May not be continuously, but it did go on for several centuries, because some of the earliest cave architectural examples and evidences at Ajanta are probably from 2nd century and 1st century BC, whereas the latest examples of paintings and sculptures and architecture from Ajanta come from 5th, 6th and perhaps the beginning of the 7th century AD. Now, we are not very sure whether this place was very active throughout these centuries, or according to some scholars the activity stopped at a certain point, the place was perhaps abandoned for a few centuries, then again a new generation of Buddhist monks occupied that place and started artistic activities over there. Whatever might be the reason, this is true that, and definitely true, that artistic activities at Ajanta continued for several centuries. Now, the look, it is very interesting that when you approach Ajanta today, when you start climbing up the staircases, trying to reach the first cave at Ajanta, which is not necessarily first cave historically or chronologically, but the first accessible cave at Ajanta. From outside it looks like this, a huge monolithic mountain, a huge body of mountain with small little niches and caves carved into the body of these mountains. But the real surprise awaits when we enter any one cave and find something like this, a gorgeous interior with beautiful pillars, very well decorated, with impeccable designs and decorations carved out with only chisel and hammer, and the entire architectural construction also seems to be done by very efficient architects with sculptural, relief sculptural decorations on the surface and often with paintings. Though it is also true that we may not be fortunate to find paintings in all the caves. Out of the 30 caves, the only I think 1, 2 and cave number 9 and 10 from the early phase, that is 2nd century and 1st century BC, and from the second phase, that is from the 5th, 6th and 7th century AD, we have cave number 1, 2, 16 and 17. So, these are the 6 caves altogether which have the maximum amount of painting on their walls. Rest of the caves are also important either because of their architectural splendor or because of their sculptural beauty, because the entire caves at Ajanta can be divided into 2 groups. There is one kind of caves which are called viharas, where you usually do not find any sculpture or painting or any embellishment, any decoration on the walls or pillars, because viharas are like dormitories where monks used to stay. But then you also have a number of other kind of caves which are known as chaitas. Chaitas are the caves where the monks and the Buddhist devotees and the followers and the preachers would come, sit, pray and worship. And these are the caves where you have maximum number of sculpture, architectural embellishment and painting. So, it is very interesting to experience a fantastic combination of architecture, sculpture and painting. These 3 activities, these 3 very specific kinds of works woven into one single project called Ajanta. This is one thing. And secondly, the contrast that you experience before you enter any cave and after you enter any one cave is also very striking. As I have already mentioned, from outside Ajanta does not promise, it does not look very promising. You really do not get any clue what could be there inside the caves. But the moment you enter the caves, this is what you see. It completely, you get a transformed experience, as if the interior of the cave has completely transformed itself into something very palpable, something aesthetically very rich, something that is very decorative, in contrast with the exterior which is very hard, harsh and left to the nature. But inside the caves it is left to the artists. So, this is one example of Ajanta cave where you can see paintings almost everywhere except the floor. You see paintings on the ceilings, on the walls and of course on the pillars along with the sculptural works. There are relief sculptures on the pillars, there are relief sculptures inside the niches, and straight at the center, deep inside the cave, you can already see the statue of Lord Buddha, the main image, the iconic image for which we are here. I mean, then when you start looking at the various corners of Ajanta caves, this is what you begin to find. some small little images of Buddha or floral and decorative images on the ceiling, which almost looks like a prototype or a copy of a wooden ceiling. Though it is a stone ceiling, and really speaking, you need not copy a wooden prototype here. The stone ceilings with the very solid pillars are strong enough to withstand and bear the load of the entire mountain. But nevertheless, they had copied the typical wooden beamed architectural ceiling, and as a result the painters got this wonderful opportunity of filling up these small little spaces or pockets with very interesting images. Then you have very interesting iconic images painted on the pillars of the Ajanta Caves. Here also, whether it is the ceiling or the pillars, because of, I guess, the space that is available to the painters, they have generally gone for smaller images or compartmentalized images, maybe a series of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas or floral decorations. But when they come to the wall, they would go for large narrative panel paintings. So, this is also a very intelligent decision taken up by the sculptors and painters and architects jointly at Ajanta when they were into the activity. They had very clearly decided that if it is a pillar or a ceiling, we would go for smaller images, we would go for singular decorative or figurative images, but if it is a wall, side wall, we would go for large narrative panel paintings, because the space itself gives us the opportunity to go for that. Hence, whereas on the pillars and on the ceilings you get religious, Buddhist religious symbols and various kinds of iconic images. On the other hand, on the side walls, on the panel paintings, you get to see narrative paintings, stories about the life of Buddha and stories from Jataka tales. These are the two things that have been elaborately narrated on the walls of the Ajanta panel. Now, before we move on to the paintings, let us take a pause and also look at at least one or two examples of architectural details. Though people generally talk about painting when they refer to Ajanta, because Ajanta painting is after all world famous. Ajanta painting is after all the classic example of Indian classical art. Ajanta painting has reached undoubtedly the pinnacle of aesthetic richness in the context of ancient Indian art, yet we should not forget that at Ajanta neither of them, I mean painting or sculpture or architecture, stands independently. They are integrally connected with each other, and one cannot be looked at forgetting the role that is played by the other. So, if we are to really appreciate Ajanta painting in terms of its location, in terms of its composition, then we need to also see how the entire planning of Ajanta painting has come up in relation to the architecture and in relation to the sculptural images found outside the caves as well as inside the caves. So, the very planning of Ajanta painting, that where do you get and what kind of images you get, is to a great extent determined by and influenced by the architectural design of the Ajanta caves. So, if it is a small little space, horizontal space right above the doorway, they would go for simple iconographic representation of Buddhas. If it is a ceiling, as I have already mentioned, nobody would dare to go for a narrative painting, but if it is a wall, there you have the opportunity to deal with narrative content elaborately, because the wall space provides you that kind of opportunity and that kind of ambition. Now, one thing I would say in relation to or with reference to this integral relationship between architecture and painting, that very often at Ajanta we find traces of painting on the body of sculpture. Now, this is very interesting, though many of those painted layers have fallen off, they have peeled off due to the ravage of time, I guess. But still, for example, when you look at this image, you can still see traces of painting on the body of this sculpture. So, this is another way of looking at this relationship between sculptural painting at Ajanta, where many of the sculptures themselves were painted, which is slightly unique. But at Ajanta we also have sculptures without any painted layers, completely dependent on the texture and the quality of its own stone. So, it seems that many of the indoor sculptures at Ajanta were painted on the surface of the stones, but there are also outdoor sculptures and a few indoor relief sculptures as well, which were never painted. The stone surface and the porous textural quality added to the aesthetic quality of the images. For example, this one. We will come back to the sculpture again later on. As far as the painting of Ajanta concerned, usually we talk about a classical style. After all, when you are looking at the 5th and 6th century Ajanta paintings at cave number 1, 2 and 16, 17, that period of course coincides with the famous classical Gupta period in India. So, it is quite natural for us to expect some classical elements in Ajanta painting which were painted in this later phase. But not all paintings at Ajanta have that classical feature. For example, this group of Buddhas, which is a small detail of 1000 Buddhas painted in one particular cave at Ajanta, do not actually carry any visible sign of classical features. Whereas, slowly as you keep looking at various other images, you can get to see in their posture, in the movement of their body, in the very curvature of their anatomy, in the rhythm of their anatomy, certain classical features are getting very, very evident. And finally, we talk about this very, very famous Bodhisattva Padmapani, which is a supreme example of classical art in Ajanta. Now, this particular figure has all the essential features of classical art, beginning with the bhanga or the bhangima, which is a kind of a posture or a body posture which evokes a graceful quality, the half closed eyes, the entire rhythm that has been kind of discovered within this very, very perfect anatomical feature of this person, and certain kind of spiritual quality. All these things in combination create what we understand as a classical style. But in order to achieve this style, the painters must have gone through enormous practice, must have gone through a rigorous kind of training to understand conceptually what is classical art and to achieve that physically in their painting and sculpture. Now, apart from the very typical Buddhist iconic images of Lord Buddha and Bodhisattvas, Ajanta is also full of images depicting the royal life, the life of the common people, the life of splendor, the flora and fauna, the natural and the vegetal world, and also strange mythical animals. So, on the one hand, at Ajanta you find images very religiously following the iconic prescriptions, and at the same Ajanta you also get to see images which are not so directly religious, but more about the life, both life of the royal people and life of the common people, including the natural and the animal world. And that is perhaps the reason why at Ajanta you get a huge number of images of birds, animals, trees, plants, along with human figures. The other interesting aspect as far as the style of Ajanta painting is concerned is the presence of different physiognomic features in Ajanta, particularly in the human figures, in the human beings. Now, so on the one hand we are talking about a classical prototype, which almost implies that all the Ajanta figures necessarily follow that prototype. But when you begin to look at the various Ajanta figures very carefully, slowly you get to see that no, that is not the case. You might have different kinds of figures with different features, almost entirely and distinctively different physiognomic features representing different races and clans, depending on the narrative panel, depending on the context. Now, before we have a look at a few figures, this is one little detail from a ceiling painting at Ajanta, wherein you get to see the engagement of the painters with the natural world outside. We can't simply write them off as merely decorative motifs, because when you look at the decorative motifs, particularly the floral motifs at Ajanta, you will see that these are not mere patterns. There is a very real, palpable and tangible connection between the painter and the vegetal world outside. Hence, even within the decorative schema, these images of flowers, plants, birds and animals, they evoke the sense of the real. They look very soft, they look very tender, they do not look like a pattern, yet they are used for a decorative pattern. For example, when you look at this elephant, this particular image of this elephant is a part of, it is not part of any religious, it does not have any religious connotation as far as this particular elephant in the given context is concerned. Yet, the elephant has all the tenderness, softness and the anatomical naturalness in its body, in its contour line, even in its look. So, Ajanta paintings, in spite of its stylistic trope or a particular stylistic framework, have also been able to explore the possibilities of bringing in naturalism into their images within their stylistic framework. All these images will prove what I am trying to convey. Now, we can conclude that the visual world of Ajanta is thus all encompassing, from religious to social, from lively natural elements to religious symbolism, from human follies to religious righteousness. Everything can be seen present within one given project called Ajanta. That is why Ajanta, stylistically speaking, Ajanta painting is not very typical. or it is not tied up with one particular kind of representation, simply because even if you focus on the various faces at Ajanta, you will get to know what I am trying to convey, and I have already discussed that. Various faces representing different clans, races, nations, countries and cultural backdrops, which means that the painters were very observant. They were observing the real world. At the same time, they were also following a certain stylistic way of doing things. Now, before we wind up, let us also talk about the humanitarian and the humanistic moments at Ajanta, and for that I would like to take simply just two very interesting examples, one from the painting, one from the sculpture, because Ajanta, whether it is painting or sculpture, is full of what we call touching moments from the life of Buddha or Jataka tales. This particular painting depicts that moment, that very touching moment when Buddha, he has been shown in a large scale to signify his spiritual power and significance. This is that moment when Buddha is meeting his wife Yashodhara and son Rahul after a long time. After so many years, after that particular moment when he had left his palace, leaving his wife and son behind. So it is after so many years he is meeting them. At what particular moment? At what particular context? That context, that moment when Yashodhara with their son Rahul also decides that no, she is also going to live the palace life, the royal life, and she is going to join the Buddhist religion. She wants to become a monk, and this particular moment was a very crucial moment for Buddha, because Buddha was also clueless at that particular point. He did not know how to respond, whether to allow Yashodhara to become a monk or to ask her to go back to the palace. No answer is given here, but that moment has been depicted with a very touching gesture and with a very touching composition. And the last one will be from a sculpture, a very famous sculpture in Ajanta known as Buddha in Mahaparinirvana. As you might know, that Mahaparinirvana is that particular phase in his life, let us call it the last phase, when he is leaving the mortal life. But he is not shown as somebody who is dead. He is shown as somebody who is in eternal bliss, who has been able to achieve that moment when he will be ultimately and finally freed from all the mortal and earthly bondings of life. He will be free from the cycle of birth and rebirth. He will be finally emancipated and liberated once and for all. Mahaparinirvana signifies that moment. Thank you.